Welcome to the final podcast in this CFO Strategy Briefing series on the topic of systemic cognitive strategy practice. In the first brief, we explored how CFOs can think across past, present and future. In the second, we looked at keeping strategic decisions clean through decision hygiene and organisational design. And in the last one, 9C, we reframed scenarios and ranges as part of the organisation's strategy system, not just as forecasting tools. In this briefing, I bring those ideas together through real cases. The illustrations I'll use are grounded in published cases and familiar industry patterns, not in confidential client work. Underneath each example is an emerging enterprise intelligence spine, powered by Systemic Cognitive Strategy Practice, SCSP as discussed in past podcasts. It's an integrated way of turning signals into options and options into action, rather than simply accumulating more information. SCSP is not separate from third wave strategy, it is the cognitive engine of third wave strategy, the way we keep renewal continuous rather than episodic. In the earlier briefings, we focused mainly on the time loops, inspection, prospection, and retrospection. But SCSP is broader than that, and deeper than that. It cultivates integrated thinking, agile shifts between perspectives, ethical scrutiny, and open dialogue, the day-to-day habits that make those loops real in executive life. Part of what drove me to structure this series on SCSP was watching, like you, a run of high-stakes decisions in the wider world that felt out of proportion to the care taken in making them. We're living through a period where the cost of bad judgment is measured in years of prosperity lost and in opportunities to stabilise the future slipping away, while things that clearly need to happen can still take a decade or more to grind through. Think of how long some trade agreements or major transitions have taken place. 10 or 11 years from first conversation to signature. Here's the punch. That is what structural indecision looks like. Inside a corporation, the same pattern shows up as decade-long transformations, or a series of one-off restructuring. There ought to be 3-year structural resets, feeding into a continuous rhythm of regeneration, not one-off crusades. That is the essence of third wave strategy. Use systemic cognitive strategy practice to keep the organisation in a state of ongoing renewal, rather than treating strategy as a rare, heroic event. CFOs sit at the junction of capital, risk and time. They may not be resolving global crises, but the way we design our own decision systems determines whether our organisations change course in months or in decades. With that backdrop, let's turn to how CFOs can orchestrate the strategy system in practice. We'll look at case studies. Our first example comes from a global home furnishing retailer. Think of a business like IKEA, with long supply chains, a large format store network, and a strong brand in multiple regions. Over the past decade, this kind of organisation has had to manage rapid growth and repeated disruptions, from port congestion and capacity bottlenecks to geopolitical events and pandemic-related shocks. When the company decided to redesign its supply chain planning, the CFO framed the initiative explicitly as a strategy system upgrade, not just an operations project. The objective was to create a planning architecture that connected long-term footprint decisions, medium-term capacity commitments, and short-term replenishment into one coherent set of loops. Several elements of SCSP became visible as a result of this exercise. Looking at the 3 contexts of inspection, retrospection and prospection. Firstly, inspection. Here, a centralised planning organisation created a weekly, standardised view of demand, capacity and inventory across regions. Finance and operations shared the same picture of what was happening now. That weekly shared picture forced integrative thinking, commercial operations and finance leaders looking at the same reality rather than defending their own partial views. Second was retrospection. Here, the team examined the old planning situation. They looked back, where fragmented systems and local optimization had led to excess stocks in some markets and shortages in others. Lessons from these reviews were built into new planning rules and escalation triggers. And third, prospection. Planners routinely modelled different demand and supply scenarios, port closures, supplier failures, regional demand surges, and assessed how alternative responses would play out. Crucially, the CFO insisted that the same scenarios used in supply chain planning be used in corporate strategy discussions and in board papers on major capital expenditure. Operations did not work with one view for the future while the board saw another. The enterprise shared a common set of futures as part of a single strategy system. On the decision hygiene side, major planning assumptions had to be documented and tested in cross-functional forums. Capacity and inventory proposals were reviewed independently by operations, commercial and finance before they came together to develop shared decisions. When the board asked how the organisation would cope with further shocks, the CFO did not confine the answer to safety stocks and earnings sensitivities. He described how the planning and decision loops worked, who monitored which signals, how often scenarios were updated, and which response options were kept open. In other words, the conversation was about the resilience of the strategy system, with financial outcomes presented as a consequence of that design. Our second example is an Asian food services group. Imagine a regional operator of central kitchens, distribution networks, and branded outlets, similar in shape to some of the listed quick service restaurant groups in Asia. The company was facing intense competition from new delivery platforms and shifting consumer habits. If you followed the evolution of multi-brand food groups in markets like Singapore or Hong Kong, you'll recognise the pattern: central kitchens, fragmented intelligence, and a need to rethink the organisational spine. Leaders had to make what I call multidextrous shifts, moving rapidly between store-level realities, network-wide economics, and group-level strategy without getting stuck in the single frame. A separate exercise, referred to as a systemic design diagnosis, revealed that operational units were tightly managed from the centre, but market intelligence was fragmented across marketing, IT, and frontline staff. At the same time, coordination mechanisms between production, logistics, and stores were weak, creating conflicts and delays. Finally, strategic conversations about new concepts and channels were blurred into routine performance reviews, limiting experimentation. The subsequent transformation program created more autonomous business units with clear mandates, strengthened the intelligence function responsible for market scanning and analytics, and clarified the role of the corporate centre. The CFO's role extended well beyond signing off the business case. By co-leading the diagnosis, the CFO became co-architect of the organisation's strategy system. Intelligence teams were tasked with structured inspection and prospection, translating customer data, digital trends, and competitor moves into a small set of strategic narratives. Over time, this intelligence function became the spine of the strategy system, the place where the external signals, internal data, and strategic questions came together before major decisions were made. Business review forums were redesigned to include explicit retrospection, which pilots had worked, which had not, and what that implied for future investments. Those forums also built in ethical scrutiny and what SCSP calls critical lift, asking not only will this grow earnings, but what does this do to our license to operate, to our people, and to the communities we serve? Capital proposals from the new business units had to show how they performed across the agreed futures and how they would adapt as conditions changed. Decision hygiene also improved. Proposals followed a standard structure aligned with a new organisation, and independent challenge from finance and the intelligence function was built into approval routines. Because the decision architecture had been redesigned deliberately, the CFO could explain to owners and lenders not just the expected financial trajectory, but how the organisation would sense, decide, and adapt as customer behaviour and delivery economics evolved. Over time, the group showed greater responsiveness and clarity in its decisions. The CFO's contribution was measured not only in improved reporting, but in the design and stewardship of the strategy system itself. The third example is a mid-sized manufacturing company that sought to upgrade its planning and board engagement in a volatile macroeconomic environment. The business was exposed to interest rate movements, cost inflation, and swings in demand across several end markets. Working with advisors, the finance team introduced a structured scenario planning process. Workshops were used to identify key uncertainties. These included input costs, demand patterns, labour availability, and regulatory changes. 3 core enterprise-level scenarios were developed, combining these drivers in distinctive ways. A flexible financial model was built to translate scenarios into revenue, margin, and cash flow projections, and to test the impact of management actions. From the outset, the CFO positioned this as a strategy system initiative, not a narrow FP&A improvement. The agreed scenario set became the reference frame for an ongoing program of decisions and adjustments, with budgets and plans treated as periodic snapshots of a living strategy, but not the strategy itself. Business units had to explain their position and performance in each scenario. Risk and capital discussions used the same futures when assessing exposures and covenant headroom, and major investment proposals were evaluated on how they performed across the scenarios and what options they created or closed. Consistent with third wave strategy doctrine, these scenarios were set against a backdrop of international and global potentially uncontrollable events just to provide reality. It also included systemic cognitive strategy practice loops, which were now made explicit and continuous. Prospection lived in the shared scenario set. Inspection came from ongoing monitoring of macro and market indicators. Retrospection took place in regular assumption reviews, quarterly at a minimum, and whenever new signals warranted, where management examined which expectations had changed and why. Decision hygiene improved as well. Different functions no longer built separate, conflicting projections. They worked from shared assumptions and structure, while still providing independent challenge on content. In board meetings, the CFO moved beyond defending a single forecast. Discussions shifted towards strategic posture. Examples? Is our mix of commitments and options sensible across these futures? How much downside are we willing to tolerate in exchange for upside opportunities? Which triggers would cause us to accelerate or slow particular investments? Overall, financial ranges express these posture choices rather than serving as standalone outputs. The final example is a composite drawn from several CFOs working through recent disruptions: rate volatility, supply chain constraints, and geopolitical shocks. In each case, the CFO deliberately changed how information was presented to the board. Meetings began with a concise recap of the organisation's core scenarios and the long-term architecture the company was aiming for. The current financial and operational position was then described in relation to those futures, not in isolation. Management's strategic posture, where the company was leaning, which options it was keeping open, and where it had deliberately chosen to commit, was discussed before detailed numbers. Forecasts and guidance were presented as ranges with clear links to the scenarios and to specific initiatives. Over time, this created a more open strategy culture, directors and executives working from shared scenarios and language, rather than treating strategy as a closed, numbers-only conversation. A simple communication structure emerged. It was made up of these 4 core elements: what we know with reasonable confidence, what remains uncertain, what we are watching as leading indicators, and how the strategy system will react if those indicators move. Boards reported that this approach gave them greater confidence. They were not being asked to believe in a precise set of numbers. Instead, they were being shown how the organisation's strategy system worked under uncertainty, how it sensed, decided, and adjusted, anchored by disciplined financial analysis. Across these examples, several patterns stand out for CFOs who choose to own the strategy system. 1. They standardise the futures the enterprise works with. A small set of shared, well-described scenarios is used across strategy, risk, planning, and board reporting, so everyone is talking about the same images of the future. 2. They treat decision processes as design tasks where decision hygiene practices, independent judgments, structured decomposition, pre-mortems, named challenges roles, are built into critical forums and organisational structures are adjusted so that information flows to where decisions are made. 3. They link initiatives to posture, not just to forecasts. Major investments and programs are evaluated by how they perform across futures, what options they create or close, and how they affect the organisation's flexibility, not only by their base case NPV. 4. They use financials to anchor strategic narratives. Numbers and ranges give discipline and credibility to strategic stories. They do not replace those stories. Financial analysis is used to sharpen choices about direction and timing. 5. They make the loops visible and repeatable. Retrospection, inspection, and prospection are embedded explicitly into rhythms. Weekly operational meetings, monthly performance reviews, quarterly strategy and board sessions, so that the enterprise learns and adapts continuously. And 6. They treat enterprise intelligence as the spine. Data analytics and insight flows are designed to provoke timely decisions and behavioural change, not just to populate dashboards. Intelligence is judged by the decisions it improves. Across the 4 episodes, you can see the outcomes SCSP is aiming for. Proactive foresight and richer scenario planning, greater resilience, more fluid alignment across functions, and ultimately, organisational intelligence, an enterprise that learns and adapts as a matter of course, not as an exception. Put simply, third wave strategy is what you get when systemic cognitive strategy practice, decision hygiene and systemic design are orchestrated as one strategy system, and the CFO takes responsibility for that system. This isn't academic. We are not short of data. We are short of well-designed judgment. In a world moving this fast, the real risk is not being wrong for a quarter, it is being systematically slow for a decade. Clearly, a system is required, one that gives CFOs the tools of systemic design so they can move from signing off decisions to shaping the way their whole organisation senses, thinks, and responds. To wrap up, in this briefing, we have explored how CFOs orchestrate the strategy system in practice. We have seen how finance leaders in different sectors use SCSP, decision hygiene, and scenario-based communication methods, not just to improve forecasts, but to shape how their organisations sense, decide, and adapt and create. The specific interests and tools will differ in your context, but the underlying role is the same. As CFO, you are uniquely placed to design and steward the strategy system, connecting futures, decisions, and numbers into a coherent whole, and serving as the CEO and board's most trusted advisor on both financial and strategic viability. Thank you for joining this episode and the wider SCSP series. Further resources and supporting materials are available at csosandbox.com, phsandl.com, where you'll find some information too on our own Power BI system referred to as Strateguy.